Should we shut the door? And if you wouldn't mind, anybody who's got a mobile phone and feels tempted to take a photograph, can you not like me? Otherwise it's a bit difficult to talk to a screen. Face is so much nicer. Thanks to Elizabeth for organising this afternoon. Thanks for everybody to come along. It's just a pleasure to speak in Holdsworth House. And let's be absolutely frank, to start with, we're here largely because of Gentleman Jack. Who's been watching Gentleman Jack? Who's watched every single one of the 8 episodes in the series? Yes. So that's something's probably away or at a meeting for one of them. But it's just been amazing. And who's been to Shibden? Well, that's virtually everybody, which is really fantastic. And looked into any of the Anlister books? Oh, quite a few people. That's brilliant. Well, you're in for a treat this afternoon, and it's not just the Prosecco. Oh, I think that's involved. And it's not Holdsworth House, a wonderful looking afternoon tea. It's Anlister in the light of Gentleman Jack. And I want to start autobiographically, if I may. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Does that apply to anybody else? Yeah. Yes. Yes. So we know what we're talking about. It, heavy inverted commas, was not ever mentioned when I was growing up. It was never mentioned. Male homosexuality or male homosexual activity was criminalised. That was serious. Jokes about the boys in blue, but it wasn't a joke. It only applied to male homosexuality and not to women, but it did affect women's lives, as I'll go on to suggest. And it wasn't until 1967 that the Sexual Offences Act was passed that decriminalised male homosexual acts. And even then,
are you taking notes? No, I was just telling somebody not to talk because I'm here with you, and not to get a book autograph.
And even then, it did have an effect on women's lives, as I'll go on to suggest. Time passed. And in 1980, I came to live in Halifax. Was anybody here living in and around Halifax in 1980?
I was born in
I don't think you're going to quite clue into what I'm going to say, quite as such, but welcome. I came to live in Halifax in 1980, and what I found, having lived in Manchester, in Edinburgh, in London, was this very traditional, very conservative, small C town. Feminism hadn't arrived, though we soon, me and a group of other women got it going, and it definitely was not. It was not a good place to be gay in. It was not a good town to be gay in. Despite the Sexual Offences Act passed 13 years earlier, it was not a tolerant town in that regard, nor other such towns, even though the Act had been passed 13 years earlier. And that applied to women as well, because the Act hadn't criminalised women, but what it did do is silence sexual relationships between women. Not illegal, but silenced. I was busy teaching at that time in the 1980s, and I knew a little bit about Anlister, not much, partly because in 1984, The Guardian published an article called The 2 Million Word Enigma. Yes, The 2 Million Word Enigma. And it was based on interviews with 2 women scholars, 2 women Anlister scholars, Phyllis Ramsden and Dorothy Thompson, who was the wife of E.P. Thompson, who's the historian who wrote Making of English Working Class, living in Halifax, you might have come across. And this article in The Guardian, 2 word enigmas, said Anlister had one of the most illegible hands ever. And anybody looked at the diary will know that's the case. And some of the diary is in code, yup, about a 6. And any enthusiastic amateur making a beeline into Halifax archives would retreat demoralised and half blind. And that is true. You know, so many enthusiastic people, I'll go and read a few pages. And it adds at the end, and this is 1984, and she may well have been a lesbian. So it was still something that you had to be a little bit careful about saying. And I thought little more about it at the time. Interesting, living near Shibden, because I was very busy teaching and working on other stuff. But another local woman did have a look. She was called Helena Whitbread, and she went into the archives and she decided to focus more on the coded sections of the diary than the handwritten. And Helena Whitbread's first Anne Lister book, called I Know My Own Heart, now got a different title, Secret Diaries of Anne Lister, was published by Virago in 1988. And it focused on the early Anne Lister, that's for the years 1817 to 1824, you probably know. And partly because it was published by Virago, who are very good at publicity, it had an enormous impact. It really did, and also particularly because Helena had focused on the coded sections, and the code was basically about Anne Lister's intimacy. Occasionally it was about confessions about how little money she had, but mainly it was about her relationships with other women, like Mariana, as we know. Gosh, impact in Halifax. Wow, local impact. Here was a local lesbian from way back, centuries ago, who were enjoying freedoms for women little dreamt of in the 1980s. I was teaching, I worked for Leeds University, and I taught adults, and I did New Opportunities Women class course in Horton House, which anybody living in Halifax would probably know Horton House. And I began to introduce pages of Helena's book into the classroom. And my students exclaimed, all to a woman. We'd no idea that sort of thing went on around here. Nobody told us. And they were absolutely amazed. I was fascinated. I'd always been hooked on women's history from the very beginning, so about 1970 onwards. So as soon as I could, I made a big line into Halifax Library, a beeline to the archives there, and I then began to add pages of the original diary to my teaching. Then the following year, 1989, the Halifax Antiquarian Society, local historians, did a day school in the library on the Anne Lister diaries. Helena Whitbread spoke, and then a lot of rather heated discussion about what earlier editors had left out. And my memory is, it's a long time ago, blood on the Halifax library carpet. Feelings ran high. And by now, I could not let it go. My curiosity was razor sharp. I mean, Anne Lister was sitting on my very doorstep, and she was a fascinating, compelling woman. So I go back into the archives, and I want to check, has the Guardian got it right that it's 2 million words? The Guardian was notorious as the Ground he had, and it probably wasn't 2 million words, anything like that. And it was on microfilm because the original diaries are too fragile for people to look at, so you have to look at it on microfilm. Anyone remember microfilm?
Yes.
Forwards,
Yes.
backwards,
Yes.
another reel. So I was counting words per line, lines per page, pages per volume, volumes per set of diaries, and maths was never my strong point. But whatever way I calculated it, it came out at 4 million words. So the diary, the Guardian, through no fault of his own, had grossly overestimated. It turned out to be at least 4 million words, 3 times as long as Samuel Pepys's diary. So I retreat from the archives and from the library, ashen-faced, and take a day or two to recover. 4 million words. What am I letting myself in for? Well, I need research strategy, that's for sure. But what? What would I do? Helena Whitbread, as we know, had read the coded sections first, and only gone on to Anne Lister's rather impossible, daunting handwriting. And I asked myself, is this really necessarily the best way to study Anne Lister? So I looked at some earlier Anne Lister editors, like John Lister, who you probably have come across, who was the first person to crack the code. And I talk about him in Nature's Domain, in Presenting the Past, how he actually cracked the diary around 1892. And I decided, inspired by people like John Lister, that the best way for me to read and understand Anne Lister was to read her diaries as she wrote them, slipping effortlessly, day by day, hour by hour, almost minute by minute, from handwriting into code, from code into handwriting. So for me, I realised quite soon I set myself a task of long hours of considerable toil. It was quite hard going. Presenting the Past came out in 1994 and tells how earlier generations of the diary editors, like John Lister, had worked on them. And I decided now to plunge in and to focus on the later Anne Lister diaries from the 1830s. And Female Fortune, has anybody dipped into this? One, two people. It's the most substantial book, came out in 1998, and you'll find, if you buy it now, you get a new edition, 2019. And this was, of course, the book which inspired Sally Wainwright to write Gentleman Jack, so which is mentioned on the back cover. So that is incredibly nice. So let's leave autobiography here. It's not about me, it's about Anne Lister. And let's return to our theme. Who was the real Anne Lister? And I'm going to focus in on Nature's Domain, because you've each got a copy of Nature's Domain on the table, thanks to Holdsworth House generosity there. So Nature's Domain was published in 2003, so it's the last of my Anne Lister books. And you'll find, I think you've got a new edition with a new preface, 2019. And it opens in April 1832, as does Gentleman Jack, you'll remember. Anne Lister had travelled in the late 20s, she lived in Paris. And then we know from Gentleman Jack, Anne Lister, aged 41, is betrayed by yet one more woman's marriage plans, betrayed by yet one more marriage plans by a woman, in this case, Vere Hobart. She sets off distraught, dejected from Hastings, and Sunday, the 29th of April, she writes in her diary, and she is distraught, and she is cast down. I have been an Icarus. Icarus flies up high, and then the sun melts the wings and down they tumble. She turns home back to Shibden, feeling pretty dejected. So May 1832, Anne Lister, forlorn, retreats back to shabby Shibden, to her family. Apart from her beloved Aunt Anne, she can't stand them all. She really can't stand them all. Her father, who is an irritating old soul, sort of shambling around Shibden, and not much of a businessman at the best of times. And her sister Marianne was really highly irritating, very irritating. She eats her meals fast, so rather than a round table like this, she eats on her own or with her aunt. And we've got images of Shibden here, thanks very much. If you like to pass them around, there should be sort of roughly one per table or nearly. If you haven't seen Shibden, this is before it becomes a museum, of course, have a look now. And she spends quite a bit of time in the library. Thanks to Uncle James, it's got a most wonderful scholarly library. Doesn't really take shown in Gentleman Jack, because seeing somebody just turning over pages of a book for 9 hours on their own in the library doesn't make for terribly compelling television. So I think Sally did have a couple of pages turned over, but I don't blame her for moving on. So where is Anne Lister? She's inherited the estate from her Uncle James, who died in 1826. And because of these ancient inherited Lister acres, she's now become a member of, albeit a minor member of the landed gentry. Hang on that. She's a member of the landed gentry. Comes back to Shibden and looks at the field patterns below and decides she must redesign Shibden, because it's so old-fashioned, it's so antiquated. She must make it more like the elegant country parks of her elite friends in London, near York, etc., etc. She's got to turn it into the landscape of desire, which is what I have as a subtitle, you'll see there. And she's got to do it fast. Anne Lister never did any hanging around. If you make a decision, you do it quickly. And she also decided she must reinvent herself. She's no longer going to be a high society flirt and European traveller, but she's now going to be the Anne Lister of ancient Shibden Hall. And what does that mean? It means she must find a life companion. And again, she must do it fast. So she draws up her wish list of women. And it includes Anne Walker of Lydgate, of nearby Crownest. Anne Walker is 29 years old, a neighbouring heiress who's inherited half of Crownest estate. Anne Lister, we'll come to that in a moment, Crownest, but Anne Lister also decides, here's Crownest coming round. You can see it's considerably bigger than Shibden. Sorry about my colour photocopy printer normally just does everything I ask it and is so fantastically obedient, but somehow when it came to Crownest, it just didn't match up. Can you just imagine the grandeur? Just imagine the size of the greenhouses. Imagine the shady looking folly, and imagine the sheet and the front. So while you're looking at Crownest, we're now going to just do a little bit more about what Anne Lister is doing. She decides to be more proactively entrepreneurial. The canal, as you probably know, arrived in Halifax in 1828. Halifax being an ancient and prosperous parish, of which Holdsworth House is an example, an outlying example. So the canal's been there for 4 years. So the town is now busily industrialising. Shibden, of course, couldn't dirty its hand with manufacturing. That really wouldn't do for members of the landed gentry at all, would it? There is a wire mill on the outskirts of Shibden, down at Mytham on the Red Beck, if you know that, but it has to be kept out of sight. But I hear tell that it employs 500 children. So it's a fair size, but you can't see it. What members of the landed gentry do, who own their own estate, like the Listers, like Anne Lister, is land-based extractive industry. That has dignity. So traditional stone quarrying, carry on, plus coal. And of course, with the canal arriving, coal and industrialisation begins to increase in value. May the 9th, 1832, Anne Lister writes in her diary, pondering to herself, might employ 4 colliers. It's not very many, is it? 4 colliers. I might clear £300 a year. So it's very small scale. And the coal seams in Halifax, as you probably know, are very, very narrow. Somebody here from Barnsley? Yeah, Barnsley, big coal seams. We've got narrow ones. Plus politics. Earlier, when she was in Paris in 1831, she confided to her diary about political reform, which was in the offing. She says, wish for ladies restored to certain political rights if they had sufficient property and education. So, I mean, just like herself, just like Anne Lister. And so in 1832, she keeps an reform bill, which is going through the House of Commons. It would enfranchise more men, women would be excluded, and Halifax gets its 2 own MPs of its own, in its own right, so Halifax becomes important. But does it matter if women like Anne Lister can't actually vote themselves? Well, not that much, because after all, she can doorstep any of her enfranchised male tenants. There's no secret ballot yet, so she'll know exactly how they would vote. So it gives her quite a bit of power, though no direct vote. And this brings us to Christopher Rawson, and I think people are beginning to hear about Christopher Rawson. You might remember Gentleman Jack, banker, lived in Hope Hall, and he is also a coal rival to Anne Lister. But come the general election in December 1832, they're all Tories together. They must support the Conservative, which is then called Tory, electoral interest. So just one note brought by Christopher Rawson's servant up to Shibden, to Anne Lister, to get one of her small tenants at the top of South Arran Bank, above the station, John Bottomley, to get him to vote for a Tory candidate. And Anne Lister says in her diary, went about the matter immediately. And then she doorsteps John Bottomley and her wife. They are left in no doubt whatsoever that if they were to vote for a Whig or anything ridiculous like that, they were out. Yeah, annual lease. And that was real, that was power. So we've got industrialisation, we've got coal, we've got politics, we've got the tenants. But let's go back to what is really our key theme, and this is sexual identity, LGBT identity as a lesbian, and a relationship with Anne Walker, who's a wealthy woman, not wealthy by London standards or York standards, and a couple of people from York, I think, yep, but wealthy by West Yorkshire Pennine standards, and who's inherited half of Cronin's estate, which you can see the main house of, with her married sister on the death of her brother, died in Naples. You want to ask questions in the Q&A about why he was dying in Naples. But so they inherit this wealthy estate. So we're talking about social class and about sexual identity. Everyone okay so far? Everyone can hear okay so far? Brilliant. So the question is, the real Anne Lister. Is she more manipulative than the average person in the 1830s? Looking at her diaries, people come to different points of view. Some editors and authors and writers and biographers, they divide, some come out one side and some come out the other side. And I invite you to make up your own minds. Early editors like John Lister in the 1890s and Philip Ramsden in the roughly 1950s, they both knew the secret code, but they didn't publish anything about it because of the criminal law criminalising male homosexual activity, which effectively silenced even writing about somebody who'd long died and their lesbian relationships. And in a sense, we can call Phyllis Ramsden, interviewed for The Guardian just before she died in 1984, the last of the first generation of Anne Lister editors. Helena Whitbread, who comes along with her book in 1988, is perhaps the first of the new generation of editors. As you know, she focuses on the early Anne Lister, and Helena Whitbread presents the fairly romantic picture, a positive image of a strong woman. And since then, well, let me just take two very recent and very different contrasting examples. Angela Steedle, anybody come across her? Gentleman Jack, yes, 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 I'm nodding, yes, yes, yes. It's came out, she's German. She came across to read the Anne Lister Diaries in English. She went back to write a biography in German, 2017, then, which had a title that had include the word erotisch in it, which we know what that means. And then it was published in English that this time last year, 2018. It's based very heavily on the Helena Whitbread transcriptions, on my transcriptions of the travel to Russia, where Anne Lister died, on Phyllis Ramsden. And what she concludes, Angela Steedle, she's pretty critical in the end about Anne, says, a woman. She was a beast of a woman. And then earlier, Kat Euler, I don't think there's anybody from Arizona.
I have her thesis at home.
I've read it.
That's good.
I'm working through it.
Kat Euler's thesis, Moving Between Worlds, PhD done at York University, dated 1995, and you can get it online, so do have a look, and you can word search it. This is Anne Lister in 1830s, and that's her focus, so it's similar to mine. And again, like Steedle, she's very, very critical of Anne Lister as manipulative, ruthless. Both these women are within the LGBT community, and they both end up very critical. So there's Helena Whitbread, there's them, and then there's me. And where am I going to go? Well, I decided to set Anne Lister firmly in her, because it's good to go on for a while. Thanks for the pictures. I determined to set Anne Lister firmly in her historical context of the 1830s, as does Kat Euler. And Anne Lister's world was not our world. Her world was very different. and I was very determined to retain a balance in my assessment of Anne Lister. So yes, both the romantic side, but also the manipulative side, shading into what we may want to say was ruthless. And I tell you the romantic writer who I found helpful here, the romantic novelist. Anyone know who I'm going to say? Jane Austen. Anyone read Pride and Prejudice?
Oh, yeah.
1813. Anyone remember the first line? I'm going to adapt it to Anne Lister, and you'll notice the adaptation. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single woman in need of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. I'll say it again. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single woman in need of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. That's the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice in 1813. And nobody particularly criticised Anne Lister for saying that she was making her heroines particularly manipulative. So what I'm going to suggest as a possibility is that Anne Lister was behaving like any slightly caddish male suitor who found himself slightly impecuniously stretched in terms of the money he had to restore and maintain his slightly flagging estate. That's kind of the line I'm taking. So let's go back to 1832 to your book, Nature's Domain, and have a look. So one of, if not the priority for Anne Lister, is she must find herself a life companion, and fast. She draws up her wish list, and it includes Anne Walker of Lydgate, who, as we know, is fairly wealthy for this part of the country, but isolated. She has enjoyed Anne Lister's education, good education. She's prone to illness and to melancholy, and unlike the Listers of Shibden Hall, ancient Shibden, the Walkers is new money, and the taint of manufacturing. The money dates back really only to Anne Lister's grandfather. I mean, really. So Anne Lister, who's only living a mile or two from Anne Walker and the Cronest estate, reacquaints herself, has a chance acquaintance with Anne Walker in July, and Anne Lister starts to woo her. By August the 17th, Anne Lister visits Anne Walker at Lydgate, which is a smaller house, and Anne Walker is living on the edge of the Cronest estate, between Hipperholme and Lightcliffe. And then she writes in code in her diary, and I have to confide to you, thought I, she little dreams of what is in my mind. To make up to her, she has money, and this might make up for rank, i.e. that it's new money. And the thought as I returned back home amused and interested me. She little dreams what's in my mind. She's money, and this might make up for rank. She little dreams what I'm up to. But how and where is Anne Lister going to conduct her wooing, her courtship, and her seduction of Anne Walker? Well, I think one or two people have dipped into Nature's Domain, haven't they? Yeah. Oh, you'll remember from Gentleman Jack, the Moss House or Chaumier, built, perhaps not quite as grand as in the film sets, but a small moss house on the slopes down from Shibden, or Chaumier, if you want to be slightly pretentious and have lived in France for a long while. But people building it called it about, and she had it built by some of her very competent tenants. And it provided the ideal female space for wooing Anne Walker. It was out of sight of Shibden. And I'm now going to suggest a fairly long reading. It's Thursday, the 27th of September, which is, if you want to read it, or just listen, it's page 63, I think. And you'll see I'm not reading the whole lot, which could take us hours. We'll be here for hours. Are we okay for the lean forward? Yep. So she's been to visit Anne Walker, and they're sauntering back. and on returning, rested in the hut and must have sat there a couple of hours. She gets home to Shibden, dinner at 7 o'clock, her aunt's with her, sat talking till she left, and then wrote the above of today. Miss Walker and I, very cosy and confidential. On parting, and Lister writes in code, she knew not when she spent so pleasant a day. I believe her. She sat and sat in the moss house, hardly liking to move. Of course, I made myself agreeable. She seemed pleased at my reminding us of our walk 10 years ago. And then over the page, I really did feel rather in love with her in the hut, and as we returned, I shall pay due court for the next few months, and after all, I really think I can make her happy and myself too. Well, said I to myself as I left her, she is more in for it than she thinks. She likes me certainly. She is more in for it than she thinks. We laughed at the idea of the talk of our going abroad would stir. She said it would be as good as a marriage. Yes, I said, quite as good or better. She said it would be as good as a marriage. Yes, I said, quite as good or better. We shall have money enough. She will look up to me and soon feel attached, and I, after all my turmoil, shall be steady if God so wills it. I can gently mould Miss Walker to my wishes, and may we not be happy. Strange the fate of things. If after all my companion for life should be Miss Walker, she was 9 and 20 but a while ago, so 12 years younger than now. How little my aunt or anyone suspects what I am about. So there we have some very candid remarks in the diary. We've perhaps all thought these things about our developing relationship, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, whatever, but we haven't always written with such candor and such detail in the diary. So that was Thursday, the 27th of September. At that point, she hadn't told her aunt about it. And then 2 days later, on the 29th of September, Anne Lister confides in her aunt about Anne Walker. And her aunt, she says, who, and she goes into code again, seemed very well pleased at my choice and prospects. Her aunt seemed very well pleased at her choice and prospects. £3,000 a year. And her aunt adds, she thought my father would be pleased if he knew, and so would both my uncles. Now, there's something very revealing about that. She thought my father would be pleased if he knew. He was only in the next door room or two. She hadn't told him. She's much closer and much more comfortable terms with her aunt, and so with both my uncles. Well, Uncle James had died in 1826, and Uncle Joseph in 1817. So what her aunt is saying, that this relationship between Anne Lister of Shibden Hall and Anne Walker of Pronest Estate is acceptable dynastically. It's fine. It's all right. It's what uncles who have passed away would have approved of. The seduction of Anne Walker proceeds first at Lydgate at Anne Walker's house, and then at Shibden, and you'll be able to read it in Nature's Domain. So how does Anne Lister manage it? How does she manage to do this? How does she manage to seduce, eventually marry a neighbouring heiress? Well, she's helped by quite a few factors, and obviously her social class and her ancient inherited acres help, but also by religion, by her Protestant religion, by Halifax Minster, and if you haven't been, please go, and by her Protestant faith, Church of England faith. And an example of this, symbolic gift exchange. Any anthropologists here? Anthropologists love symbolic gift exchange. One tribe in the middle of nowhere meets another tribe, and to show you're friendly, you exchange some valuable fruit or some cloth or something. This is, and we're now into November, end of November 1832. Anne Lister took a book, a prayer book called Forms of Prayer for Christian Families. Forms of Prayer for Christian Families, which had only been out 3 years. And she goes to a bookbinder's and ordering it to be bound in crimson leather, purple warm silk fly leaves, and richly gilt. So it's leather, it's silk, it's gilt, it's symbolic. And then she writes in it, and it's back from the bookbinders by now, it's the 7th of December, and she writes in it for Anne Walker. This is what she writes. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doth the will of my Father which is in heaven. This is Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, O Lord, 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 shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. In other words, Anne Lister had a religious certainty that she was doing the right thing by her nature and therefore by God in terms of sexuality. She, Anne Lister, could have hope that she would enter the kingdom of heaven because she was doing the will of my Father, i.e. God. And as we know, for Anne Walker, it wasn't so clear cut. For Anne Walker was much more of a tormented person. She was much more conventional. She was much more prone to guilt. She was quite ill at times. And she was surrounded, in a way that Anne Lister wasn't, by a whole number of suspicious relatives who knew Anne Lister of old. And the Rawsons particularly had got their eyes out of Halifax. So what was Anne Lister up to? It wasn't a particularly easy relationship. So November the 23rd, Anne Lister writes, she's fed up with Anne Walker. She writes, I shall pass away like a meteor and leave no trace behind. She's just getting fed up with all these forwards and backwards with Anne Walker. And I'm tired of her, Anne Walker's moody, melancholy pother, much fussing and equivocation. It wasn't an easy relationship, wasn't completely an easy relationship. So let's jump forward as we move towards the end to 1834. Anne Lister is absolutely clear. It must not be a transient relationship. It must not be a transient connection. It must be a settled union, as near to a marriage as she could get. And it must be sanctified in the church, in other words, before God. And that involves two ceremonies, like any heterosexual marriage. First of all, it involves a betrothal. So February 1834, Anne Lister and Anne Walker travel in Yorkshire. They're visiting some of her friends up near York. And they exchange rings, and then Anne Lister goes into code. They exchange rings in token of our union, which is now understood to be confirmed forever, though little or nothing was said. Though little was nothing unsaid, and Lister said, and Lister feels it's confirmed forever. But Anne Walker's ambivalences, silences, agonies continue compared to Anne Lister's strong commitment about God, about her nature, which takes us to York. And this one first was York. Yep. York, very important. March 1834, Easter Sunday. And in code, we start on Easter Sunday. 3 kisses, better to her than to me. And then they go to Goodram Gate, which is just in the shadow of the York Minster. If you haven't been, do go. Goodram Gate Church at 10:35. Miss Walker and I and Thomas the servant, you never, if you're elite women, as Anne Walker and Anne Lister was, you never carry your Bible in your prayer book yourself. You have a servant, in this case a male servant, to walk behind and carry your Bible and prayer book. Miss Walker and I stay, and Thomas stayed for the sacrament, and then a little bit else, and she goes on to back into code on Easter Sunday. The first time I ever joined Miss Walker in my prayers, I had prayed that our union might be happy. I had prayed that our union might be happy. She had not thought of doing as much for me. In other words, this isn't necessarily a very equal union, despite how much Anne Lister wanted it. It seems to be it meant so much more for Anne Lister than for Anne Walker. And there are these growing suspicions, especially when Anne Walker moves into Shibden, suspicions about Anne Lister's sexual intentions and suspicions about her financial intentions, about this vulnerable, isolated heiress. So, as we know, Gentleman Jack Series 1 ends here, and I'm going to end here. No spoilers, as we don't know what's going in series 2. And Lister brings Anne Walker back to live at Shibden, and by September, with Anne Walker's furniture brought by cart from Lightcliffe to Shibden, there's some sort of domestic harmony, that they have very separate interests. Of an evening, Anne Lister might be reading the newspaper, as one does. She'd like to keep up to politically, whereas Anne Walker more likely to be involved with local philanthropy on a quite sort of small scale. But they did share some activities together, of which will reading was a language of love. Which sounds funny to us. It sounds very weird to us, not to them, because their world was very different to our world. Will reading and will redrafting their worlds was the language of love of an evening, because they had to leave a life interest, and we can come on to that in the question and answer afterwards, to the other woman. So it's about property. But all this while, the prying eyes of the relatives, both from Lightcliffe, like the Priestleys, Gentleman Jack, Mrs. Priestley, William Priestley, and the Rawsons. So let's end by saying, who was the real Anne Lister? Was she no worse than any other caddish suitor with expenditure ambitions, or was she a feminist icon for our modern age? Let's go back to Jane Austen and decide whether she was just average, or was she the romantic icon for the LGBT community? And since Gentleman Jack has a massive emotional following, which we could all absolutely understand, or was she somebody slightly more manipulative and in some senses cruel? Gentleman Jack has had the most profound effect on any of us, watching television and interested in Anne Lister. But I'm going to stop there, and I hope, and I know there's going to be lots of questions of things that I didn't make clear, you really disagree with, or you'd like to know more about, or I don't know who'd like to start off with Q&A. Anybody got a question that they might like to ask, or anything I said that I whizzed over too quickly? Perhaps nobody's drunk enough Prosecco. Have another swig. Anybody at all? Go on.
Do you admire?
I do admire Anne, and one of the times I totally admired Anne Lister was in 2003, when with my sister and my partner and her partner, the four of us climbed up Big Merle in the Pyrenees, which Anne Lister had climbed up in 1838 with one local guide. I thought, this is such agony. This is so awful. I've got to wear crampons. I've got to wear crampons climbing over a glacier with crevasses, and we have to hurry because as the sun gets up and the crevasses open. When we got to the top of Big Merle, it just looked absolutely brilliant. You could see Spain one side looking a bit arid, France the other side looking wonderfully green, where we'd come from. And we clambered down. I thought, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to do this. Imagine doing it in 1838. And we all wore trousers, but she wore a skirt which she sort of hitched up slightly with sort of string or rope and stuff, the boots. But I thought, any woman doing this. And I just give you one other example of where I think she was just staggeringly amazing. She read geology. She kept up to date with the latest geology journals, which might not sound totally gripping and compelling, but it was a time when people began to think, well, how did the world begin? And if Genesis says that about God creating in 7 days, well, how come these bones are being found and these layers? And people say, look at that cliff, it's got layers. And she was reading in the geology journals about a geologist called Charles Lyell. And the other person who was reading it was the young Charles Darwin, who's kind of like half a generation younger than Anne Lister. Now, Charles Darwin has certain privileges that Anne Lister could never think about or enter into, which was going to university. Not a single woman could go to university. And if you couldn't go to university, you certainly could join the learned societies, which thrived in London and other big cities, which kept the intellectual debate alive for people like Charles Darwin. And at one point, Anne Lister is poised thinking, oh, this is very interesting about these different layers, and how did the world art, and is reading, and Charles Darwin sets off on the Beagle for about 5 years, I think it is, and sails over the horizon. Now, no digital anything then, but he lost touch with the debates of the day, the new research. Anne Lister didn't. But what she did do, and for slightly different very different reasons for Charles Darwin, she retained her faith in the Anglican Church, and the Church of England, believed very much that the sort of right of centre Anglicanism of the Reverend Musgrave, the vicar of Halifax, and the church procedures in Halifax Minster. She didn't want to challenge God. She was a devout Christian, as that gift, ornate gift of prayers for Christian families, to Anne Walker demonstrates. There's an answer to a short question. Go on.
Is there much fact about the coal mining aspect? Or was it elaboration, fabrication? Because that part she seemed to be very on the ball with it. But
she was on the ball. I think what we have to accept with a dramatisation like Sally Wainwright's, and I didn't have a chance to say in my talk that Sally Wainwright is the most brilliant scriptwriter.
Yes.
She really, anybody could do Scott and Bailey, and then Last Tango in Halifax, and then Happy Valley, and then Gentleman Jack, and keep us all glued to the sets. It's just a genius. And she's not a diarist, diary editor, or a biographer like Angela Steedle. She's a dramatist, so necessarily there's a little bit of dramatic license. I don't think anything that I remember from series 1 about the coal mining was untrue. What she did do is pull things, she brought some things forward which wouldn't necessarily see that Gentleman Jack series 1 ends in Easter 1834, doesn't it? And I think she's brought some coal mining forward just to sort of enrich the plot. But she's basically got it right. The Rawsons, who are coal mine owners nearer Halifax, and Shibden Hall estate were coal mining rivals. But I think if you read particularly Female Fortune, and I hope you can, I have quite a bit about coal mining in that, and it was cutthroat rivalry. And remember, in Gentleman Jack, God, what's his name who plays her father? Timothy West says, coal mining, it's a dirty business. Which in fact, he doesn't actually say, I don't think, but you can imagine him thinking it. He keeps on saying, coal mining, it's a dirty business. And he was absolutely right. It's probably some of the dirtiest. You can't tell what's going on underground. There was flooding, there was child labour, there was trespassers and trespassing underground, and it was a dirty business, but it was a lucrative business. And some of the coal mine owners, not just the Royals, but others, like the stocks of Upper Shibden. If you've anyone been up to the top of Shibden Valley, there's stocks is Upper Shibden Hall there, as was. They took Anne Lister for a bit of a gullible fool. She's a woman, after all. So she wasn't. She was very canny about coal prices. You might remember in Gentleman Jack, she gets about all the money that
speech was just brilliant.
Yeah, she got on top of it very, very quickly. And the thing about her, she could read about anything. If she needed to know about horticulture, she'd read the latest horticultural book, or about gardening, or about coal mining, or estate management. Any other questions at all?
In your earlier remarks, you mentioned a woman's name. I don't think I have it right. 1834, Phyllis
Ramsden. So you can read about her in Presenting the Past, which the first half of which is about the early Anne Lister editors. The first was John Lister, her indirect descendant, who inherited Shibden Hall, or his father did, who cracked the code, a melodramatic tale in Presenting the Past, around 1892, with a fellow antiquarian from the historian. And then Muriel Green, who worked on the letters, who went into Shibden Hall on Anne Lister's death in 1933, and was tasked with sorting out and listing the Anne Lister and Shibden Hall papers. It took her 2 years just to list all the books. I think that's right, was it 2 years to list all the letters? It took ages. You know, she was a trainee librarian, and she did her dissertation on the Anne Lister letters, and there is a book on her letters, a short book, and also a copy of her thesis in Halifax Library, if you wanted to look more comprehensively at the letters. Then Phyllis Ramsden, after the war, in the 1950s, had access to the code, as had John Lister, once he cracked it, and did a summary of the coded passages, which anybody thinking of transcribing Anne Lister diaries are going to find very, very helpful. And also wrote on her travels, and Angela Steedle, as I mentioned, has borrowed quite heavily from Phyllis Ramsden's work on the travels in Russia and other travels in Europe. What was the question?
Who she was, and then you gave her a title of, or classified as one of the older Anne Lister writers, or one of the, when she died, she was the oldest Anne Lister writer.
No, I'm not sure I quite say she was the oldest, but she was what I was trying to say. She, I think she died in 1985. The Guardian article came out in 1984. So she represented that last wave of earlier Anne Lister editors for whom speaking about lesbianism or publishing anything about lesbianism, it was silence. You know, and I said when I came to Halifax in 1980, it wasn't a good place to be. It wasn't a good town to be gay in, and I think that pertained, you know, for another few years. And then Helena Whitbread's book, I Know My Own Heart, on the early Anne Lister, very much a focus on the coded sections, and Lister's sexual relationships, particularly with Mariana, was the sort of start of the newer wave of Anne Listers, like myself and others. Anybody else like that?
Sorry, where did Vivian fit into there?
Oh, and did Vivian? How did Vivian fit in? Yes, good question. Vivian Ingham was a friend of Phyllis Ramsden, and they worked together on the coded sections. And Vivian Ingham wrote an article on climbing the Pyrenees. Is that her article? I think it is. It's in Presenting the Past. Yeah. So they worked closely together. I suppose one tends to talk more about Phyllis Ramsden because Phyllis Ramsden's papers are in the Shibden, are in the archives here, if you want to have a look at them. Yeah. And one of the stories is that when she died, I think it was 1985, she asked her relatives, I don't know if she had children or nephews or nieces, to burn the sections of her papers which had this dangerous material in. And you know, whether it was burning or destroying, we don't know. I don't know. I've heard this story about somebody who's met one of her next generation descendants, and it does seem odd that there's so little. There's the summaries of the coded sections, but not actually the coded sections transcribed. So there you have Halifax in the mid-1980s and the silencing of lesbianism. Anybody else who hasn't spoken? Yeah, go on.
What do you think her relationship with her mother was like? Considering
not brilliant, not brilliant, not good.
Yeah, I mean, she sent away at 7. She mentions that she's breastfeeding at 7 of her mother, isn't she?
I don't think it was a good relationship. Yes. There is a book on the very early Anne Lister by Patricia Hughes, and that's the one to read. Basically, Anne Lister, plus her sister Marianne, and the 4 brothers, 2 of whom died in infancy, 2 of whom died as young men. John died when he was a teenager, and her brother Sam when he was not much older. They lived in slightly pokey circumstances in a very modest house when they were in Halifax. And Anne Walker writes to Sam when he's a soldier in, I think he's away in Ireland, and she writes to him. And they actually have quite a close relationship. And they're just embarrassed by their parents. I mean, their father, I mean, for heaven's sake, he was a captain. One of the other relations, more distance, was General Fawcett. At least he became a general, was their father was really a captain. Mother, did she take the bottle? I mean, so embarrassing. This little house, sort of dog kennel they have to live in. So after Sam's death, and there were no male heirs left. Anne Lister becomes increasingly up, unmarried James, unmarried Aunt Anne, both living at Shibden. From 1815, she lives at Shibden. So I think we can say after the death of Sam in particular, she sort of cuts her nuclear family, her immediate family off, and her relationship with Marianne is not good. It is not good. And do read Other Nature's Domain or Female Fortune to get the real gist of how her sister is banished. Anyway, more cheerfully, how about another question? Anybody not spoken? Yeah, go on.
And unlisted died, what did she leave Anne Walker in a will?
They both, well, as I said, and I know everybody laughed, it was true, that will reading was the language of love of an evening once they'd married and to Shibden, and they left each other a life interest in the other woman's estate. So had Anne Walker died first, which was a sort of expected, what was might expected, because Anne Walker was so ill, Anne Lister was so fit, she climbed big hills, she walked so fast. Sir Anne Jones doesn't exaggerate too much, she just paced around so fast. But it happened to be, but they got to set sail from Shibden in 1839 and got to St. Petersburg and then down to Moscow and then down to the Caspian Sea, then down to the Caucasus, and they're in Western Georgia. It's the fever-carrying tick which bites Anne Lister, and she dies fairly soon, not Anne Walker. So it is Anne Walker who's left with the unenviable task of bringing the corpse back in a lead-lined coffin. Obviously, there are two servants, a male and female servant, but Anne Walker has to, we would imagine, organise some of it. And it is she who inherits Shibden Hall for her lifetime, forever, but for her lifetime. And the tragic story of what then happens to Anne Walker and her forcible removal from Shibden Hall, assisted by the local constable who breaks down the door, I'll leave you to read in Presenting the Past. All these stories are rather uncheerful. Questions got uncheerful answers. Questions with a cheerful answer. Who hasn't spoken yet?
What is the Guardian? What is the
Guardian.
Yeah,
Anybody?
Newspaper of transport.
Maryland? I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry. I should have said the Manchester Guardian.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I should have
It's a
said the Manchester
newspaper.
Guardian.
I'm sorry. No.
It's the Manchester Guardian. Sorry. It was the Manchester Guardian there because it had gone down to London in the mid-80s. I'm pretty sure it had.
Yeah.
It's just about the last 20 years or so it went down to London. So it's the Manchester Guardian. Sorry. Apologies to everybody who hasn't grown up with the Guardian.
We have the Washington Post. It's
Yeah.
exactly-
What you mentioned, me being extremely ignorant, what you talked about, the Guardian article thing, the
2 million.
2 million, I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit of that?
Well, how do you mean? What was it in the Guardian article? That's what I've said.
Yeah.
It was an interview with Dorothy Thompson, who is a historian in her own right and had been living in Halifax with her husband, E.P. Thompson, who's one of the best-known historians of the last century, probably, wrote The Making of the English Working Class when he was in Halifax. She'd begun to do some work on Anne Lister. She was getting a grant. She worked at Birmingham University to do a transcription of a few years of the early Anne Lister. And then Phyllis Ramsden, who we know has been working on the Anne Lister coded sections, doing a summary of them, and also doing writing articles, some of which were published, or you can see them, typescripts in the Halifax archives about Anne Lister's travels. So the article was shaped around the interview of those two women and what they said. And it was really the first thing that brought Anne Lister to the attention of public attention outside this small circle of antiquarians, a fairly small circle of Halifax antiquarians. Because one of the things I haven't mentioned, and I don't mean all my answers to be depressing, but we haven't talked about the Criminal Law Act of 1885, which further criminalised male homosexual activity or behaviour. 1885, it made it more harshly penalised men found having a relationship with another man. John Lister, very scholarly, went to Oxford, a genuine antiquarian, was probably gay. There's no documentary evidence that. It's just very probable, sort of hearsay. That's what I think. That's what I guess. We can't know for certain. So when he cracked the code with a antiquarian, Arthur Burrell, who came from, he was a schoolmaster in Bradford Grammar, in 1892, they were both shocked about what they discovered about Anne Lister and her homosexual relationships with other women in and around Halifax. And Burrell suggested they might burn the Anne Lister diary because it was just so dangerous. It was just so tricky, difficult, controversial. John Lister, an antiquarian, a historian, a scholar, a true scholar, could not bring himself to burn the diaries. He knew their intellectual value. But he couldn't dare have them out in the public. It was just far too dangerous, so he put them back, as you probably know, back behind secret panels at Shibden Hall. And what followed from there, and that's 1892 or thereabouts, was a 30-year silence until his death or 40-year silence until his death in 1933. He didn't write another word about Anne Lister. He didn't, as far as I know, breathe another word or say quickly another word about Anne Lister. It was just silence. And I think that said it all. If you go to Shibden Hall, who's been to Shibden Hall fairly recently? And you look at that portrait, that photograph in the main room of the four antiquarians standing at the doorstep of Shibden, and they look pretty solid. I think I'd suggest that John Lister looks sad beyond sad, grave beyond grave. And my feeling is that's the reason he's just harbouring the secret about his ancestor may at some point come out. And it was very, very hard for him, I think. Have we got time for a final question, or has anybody got a final question who hasn't spoken yet?
There is one from live stream, if I can ask that. That Anne and Anne both signed their wills at the Grey Laws Office in 1836, but only Anne's can be found. Have you found Anne Walker's will?
I don't think I have. The problem between looking at the Shibden Hall papers and the Anne Lister papers and looking at the Crowness papers and anything that Anne Walker wrote is the Anne Lister papers, despite the temptation to burn the diaries in around 1892, they're pretty intact. Go and speak to the archivist and say, how many metres of archive shelf do the Shibden Hall papers take up? And he'll, Dan Swindrum, the archivist, will, it's miles and miles. And then you go to the Crowness papers and they're just weeded. They're just absolutely weeded. I've used them for, in particular, in Female Fortune. There's a whole strand of the story, which I haven't had time to look into, to touch on this afternoon, for which apologies, which is Anne Walker's brother-in-law. And, yeah, nodding, anyone seen Gentleman Jack? Been up to Scotland, Inverness-shire. Anne Walker's sister Elizabeth married Captain Sutherland, an impoverished Highland military captain, and he married, I don't say he married for money, but he married money because she, like Anne Walker, had inherited half the Shibden Hall estate. Crowness, sorry, my fault. Crowness estate, and she was kept in Scotland, perpetually either pregnant or breastfeeding or burying one of her infants. It was a very tragic, and kept in good touch with Anne Walker, and a lot of letters. And you can see in some of the Captain Sutherland letters how he, like the Rawsons or the Priestley's, Win Priestley and his wife, were very suspicious of Anne Lister and her motives. And there's a lot of weeding that have gone on. So what we find in the Cronus papers is very, very partial. I think we need to cheer ourselves up with some book signing and tea and more Prosecco, because I haven't intended it that every question should end on that. But let me just say that I've got an immense admiration for Anne Lister. I just think she's fantastic. You know, whether it's reading geology journals or climbing Fig Merle or all the things she did, she was absolutely amazing. Do I completely trust her? If I was her friend. You each make up your own mind. Everyone will make their own mind on that. So shall we?
I have one last question. Maybe this is kind of, what was your high point or joyous point in doing all this? What's the high point? What was the good thing about all this? And on a high note, not a sad note.
I think the whole lot was a high point because, you know, that book is December 1833 to end of April 1836. So it's 2.5 years, which doesn't sound much, does it? But it's that much of a diary. It's that much a diary. And I felt very sort of pleased, I kind of patting myself on the back that I managed to read it. I intended to read it. Impossible handwriting, so abbreviated, then into the code, which actually isn't that difficult once you've got the key to the code from John Lister or Phyllis Ramsden, then back and begin to understand what was it that kept this woman going, that maintained this woman's faith in herself, partly social class, partly Protestant religion and her relationship to Halifax Minster and the Anglican faith, partly her education. She just was an absolute amazing woman. And let's hear it for Anne Lister.
Okay, tea's on its way.
Tea's on its way, and I think if you'd like to have a book signed, and one question that nobody asked, and I just thought somebody might, did Anne Lister ever come here? That's the sort of question here. I think not. Did Anne Lister know Miss Wadsworth, who lived here? Not really. She looked down on Miss Wadsworth because she only lived. She writes down how much income Miss Holdsworth has per year.
£700.
It's something like so. Yes, you've had a look. £700, and this is the 1820s. And if you compare that to Anne Walker's income, I don't think she deigned. I mean, Anne Lister was a snob, a consummate snob. So, but there is the Miss Wadsworth diary in the archives if you want to have a look. So, shall we move on to tea and books and Prosecco and? Thank you.